And that was a really intriguing conversation for me. And again, they were talking about dollars left on the table, dollars that weren't being properly deployed, and why weren't we investing in those things that really matter. I think we're going to have a similar conversation today. But what you'll see in the report, for example, is the one comment that resonated with me was when they said, you know, we have about $8 billion that goes to the state of Michigan, and it never comes back to the local communities. And they said at least $1 billion of that were dollars that could go into the city of Detroit, for example, but were not coming back to Detroit. Well, if you look at our report, it says that if we were actually utilizing and preparing all of our human capital across the state and in Michigan, in Detroit, and they were fully employed, that would generate $3.7 billion of additional tax revenue, that most of that would be in the city of Detroit. And so while we're looking at dollars and we're saying that we don't want increased taxes, what I'm saying and what the report says is we're leaving dollars on the table, dollars that could benefit all of us. And so this session is going to be one that we really get to action, one where we talk about the actions that are happening across the state and how all of us can do more and be more intentional and collaborative about how we make our actions matter most for those people that we care most about. And so at this point, I would like to introduce our panel, or have our panel join us as we begin this conversation.
Joining LaJune Montgomery Tebron on stage is Senior Community Development Analyst for the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve, Heidi Kaplan. President for Grand Rapids Community College, Bill Pink. Vice Chairman and Chief Administrative Officer for DTE Energy, David Meador.
So welcome, everyone. As we have discussed, we really want this session to talk about actions that we've taken, that we're considering, and the way that we are moving forward and really thinking about developing human capital and a better workforce that grows the economy. So I would like to just begin by asking you all, because you're practitioners, you're doing this work, why don't we each first go through, and why don't you talk a little bit about what work you believe has the most potential and work that you think we should all know about as we're thinking about how we might engage. I'll start with Dave, and we'll just go down the line.
Well, good afternoon. I'm here really wearing two hats. So as a major employer in Michigan, not only our 10,000 employees, half of whom are going to retire in the next 5 years, also in our supply base, we employ a lot of people. But my second hat is I co-chair the Mayor's Workforce Development Board in Detroit. And as I stepped into that role, I really started to understand what workforce systems are, and in our case, how dysfunctional they can be, where we have, as I describe it on some level, we have a supply side that basically is identifying and training people for jobs, except for not many of those people find their way to work. And on the demand side, we have employers who have large numbers of openings right now, including skilled trades that they can't find people for, and then projected huge numbers of openings in the next 5 years. And the system's disconnected. So we've been working to understand the dysfunctionality of the system and reconnect that. And then also within this system, trying to identify and remove barriers. So an example is we went to start doing this work. We were working on a prison reentry program because hiring returning citizens is a really important initiative. Well, lo and behold, one of the things that I wasn't aware of that we bumped into was 75% of the returning citizens trained for jobs had driver responsibility fees. So we had 350,000 people in Michigan that owed $600 million that couldn't get their driver's license back. But if you're coming out of prison, you don't have a job, you don't have money, how are you going to pay these fees? In Detroit, there were 77,000 people that had these fees on average $1,600. So that's an example of a barrier, and part of the work we're doing in workforce is identify barriers and remove them. So we got legislation passed, and those fees will all be rescinded by October of this year. But that's just one of many, many barriers, and we're just going to have to continue to identify those and kind of take them out of the system one by one as we try to rewire this whole workforce system.
Great. And I think I happen to also be on the Workforce Development Board, and what I will tell you is that that partnership is a place where everyone comes to the table to talk about these issues, and that was the missing piece, because we would work in our individual pathways and the communication wasn't such that we could combine and understand how a barrier in one sector is impacting another sector, and that's the beauty, I think, of that table. Dr. Pink, would you like to add to this conversation?
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much, Lejeune. Good afternoon, everyone. Bringing you greetings from Grand Rapids Community College, and it being the oldest community college in the state of Michigan and one of the oldest in the country, we're honored to be represented on such an esteemed panel this afternoon. If I was going to tell you a mantra when it comes to our campus and in the year that I've been blessed to be the president at GRCC, there are two words that we use: relevant and responsive. Are you relevant and are you responsive? Relevant, meaning is what we do as a community college, is it truly relevant to our work, our community, our students, and each other? Do we stay relevant? I often use the example of Blockbuster Video. When was the last time you went to Blockbuster? That's what I thought. There are about 9 of them left in the world that I know of, and I'm not sure if those are going to be around that much longer. What happened? They took their eye off of what relevance really was. And also what happened is Netflix. But what happens with relevance is that when you do not pay attention and you do not pay attention to the needs of your community, of your students in our case, and of our employees, you find yourself waking up one day being irrelevant, and that's what we do not want to be. But the second word is what I want to focus on today is responsiveness. How responsive are we to our community, to our students, to each other? And so with what I talked to you about today, it is a result of, from our standpoint, of what we think about as responsiveness. So I will give an example that we have in West Michigan. One of our strong partners, St. Mary's Hospital, their president, Bill Manns, good friend of mine. One thing that they have done in this space is, and what you'll find with St. Mary's is that partnerships matter, and I'll come back to that more and more as we go on along this conversation. Partnerships matter, collaboration matters. So what St. Mary's has done is that they have instilled a hiring process that is meant to get rid of any bias, because that's what we find so often in some of our partners when it comes to what their ethnicity and that diversity looks like. Sometimes it's so thin because there are some of those biases that are within the process. It might be conscious, it may be unconscious. Bias is bias, and bias still causes people not to get jobs who might deserve a job. And so what St. Mary's has done is that they have instituted this unconscious bias, or this process that looks at every applicant. And when you talk to Bill Manns, what he'll do is he'll tell you his goal wasn't to increase diversity at St. Mary's. His goal was just to create a level playing field when it comes to hiring. That was the goal. Remember that. Wasn't to diversify the workforce. It was just to create a level playing field. And so what they've done is that they have instituted things within the interview process, some of the double-blind reviews of applicants, so you don't see what the name is going in, because sometimes names give away cultural background, right? So that you don't have some of these things that may give some level of bias to where, friends, what has happened at St. Mary's since instituting this, they went from about an 18% of new hires being from a diverse background, people of color, to now 38% as of earlier this year. That type of turnaround. And again, it wasn't just based on diversifying the workforce. It was based on creating a level playing field. And what the PS is on all that Bill will tell you, is that what they have found is that as they have gone down this road, the quality measurements, that they use and that they are being tracked for their company as far as their accreditation and all those quality marks of how customers are being serviced and how patients are being serviced, those quality marks have gone up. And so what he has shown to his workers, to his workforce, and to our community in Grand Rapids is that this is work that is well worth the effort and can build and bring positive results to your company. And so from our standpoint, I'm working with the mayors. Dave is on the east side. I'm working with our mayor in Grand Rapids, Mayor Bliss, on a Grand Rapids Race and Equity Initiative, where our focus is just that. How do we get companies in West Michigan and Grand Rapids? How do we get our Grand Rapids companies to be more inclusive in terms of the idea of level playing field when it comes to hiring? And that example that I gave you with Bill Manns and his hospital at St. Mary's is one of those hallmarks that in our initiative we are using to say, here's a light that needs to be shown on this effort because of the results that we are seeing.
Great, thank you so much. Heidi, thank you for being with us from the Federal Reserve. And please tell us a little bit about what's happening more nationally in this space around workforce development and actions that really work.
So I think both these gentlemen set the stage for me pretty well. First of all, I want to say hello from Washington, D.C. I think I'm one of very few non-Michiganders here, but I've really enjoyed all the hospitality and the beauty of this part of your state. The first thing I want to pick up on is Dave mentioned the need to rewire a workforce development system. And I would actually like to say I don't think we ever had a workforce development system. And so what we're trying to do, and to a great deal, is cobble one together. K through 12 is very clear how you take your kid to school and where you go to school and what the next steps are. And then you graduate, and in past years, people either went to college or received training from their employers through maybe an apprenticeship or through other types of vocational training. And that system had worked for us, or for many people, for a very long time. And now there seems to be a great skills mismatch that we're talking about. How do we get people, with all the many options there are out there, with all the different types of universities, whether they're 4 years and for-profits, whether they're vocational schools or 2-year schools, how do people navigate where they need to go, what's worth their dollars, which is often a lot of dollars, and how do employers get in touch with the right school to get the types of skills they need to fill the jobs that they have available. And this, I think, is incredibly complicated. And it's made even more complicated by the fact that funding is very decentralized. So we have a small amount of federal funding that guides some workforce training around the country through WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And then we have some federal funding through Pell Grants, which students can use at a variety of schools. And then, other than that, trainers and students and employers are cobbling together what they have. So I think there's a major need to work on collaboration and to see ways to provide regional collaborations. And I know most cities have worked on that. I think Atlanta right now is doing a particularly good job on trying to coordinate through a new effort called the Metro Atlanta Exchange on a very, very large collaboration for a group that was very, very disparate. What really pushed this effort forward is they did a survey of the Fed actually did a survey of their workforce development agencies and found that 80% of the folks that claimed to do workforce development did not have a direct relationship with an employer. So they were training people for something irrelevant or possibly irrelevant. So these efforts are really, really important, and I think it's going to take some time to get them together, but I think they have to be very focused on creating information paths and pathways for both employers and students. The other thing I want to pick up on is what Bill was talking about in terms of hiring practices. And we've focused quite a bit at the Fed on disparities in the labor market. So we know right now the unemployment numbers are fantastic if you look nationwide. They are not fantastic if you look at some subgroups, particularly ex-felons, people of color, and rural communities. They are also not fantastic if you look at labor force participation rates for most of those groups. where as high as the numbers are for unemployment, they're even higher in terms of folks that have just fallen out of the labor force altogether. And what I want to pick up on from Bill is that hiring practices, I think, have improved some, but we had some recent research presented at the Fed that showed that keeping people in jobs is equally as challenging, particularly for Black men. And that the disparities that we're seeing are huge in terms of job retention. It's not clear why people are separating from jobs, whether they're being fired or laid off or leaving on their own because of issues that they can't manage outside of work, whether that be transportation, health issues, et cetera. But we need to do more also on keeping people in jobs, and we need to learn more about what people need, and that may be mentorships, it may be transportation, it may be childcare, but a holistic view on how we can make sure people can get to the jobs and keep them once they obtain them.
Thank you, Heidi. And before we continue, I meant to mention on every table there are blue cards, and they are for your questions. Please write your questions down, and you can write them down throughout the session. We'll pick them up, and at the end we'll have a Q&A to respond to your questions. So feel free to jot down your questions as we move forward. As we think about this and we continue this conversation, you know, I think about Michigan, and the Amazon experience, I think, taught us a lot. And since then, I've heard many people talk about those kind of two main factors, talent and transportation, right? Talent and transportation. How are we doing in Michigan in generating the talent for this workforce effort? How's that pipeline coming in, and are there things that we're doing or discovering as we're doing this work that could really help us as we move forward?
You bring up transportation. We could talk about that for the rest of this time frame. As you know, it's one of the major themes here, that the lack of regional transit's a huge issue in Southeast Michigan and other parts of the state. So, you know, in Detroit, we have 2/3 of the jobs held by people who live in the suburbs, and the opposite also in Detroit. We have very few what we call point of entry jobs. So people in Detroit that are looking for work have to look in the suburbs, and it's near impossible. You know, you're taking, in many cases, people taking multiple bus routes, an hour and a half to get to work, or walking, 10 to 20 miles. It's just ridiculous. But we should probably set that one aside because, we're working that one pretty intensely right now. But we know that Michigan has an education problem. It's really hard to talk about talent development with a state that ranks 49th in terms of educational performance. And so what we're finding in many cases, as I'll speak for the business community, if we're going to be very intentional about trying to hire people, we have to be open to the fact that people could have academic deficits and be okay with that. Say, I want to hire you because you could be a great employee, and we're going to have to work with you on your reading and math skills. We're going to have to acknowledge that you might not have general employability skills, how to dress, how to show up on time, how to take feedback from a supervisor. So what you're seeing the business community finally opening up to say, if we're going to be diverse and inclusive and bring in people into the workplace that otherwise would be locked out, we have to change how we hire, how we onboard. And then for the first time now, you're seeing companies actually bring in social workers into the workplace to help make sure they're giving the right wraparound services to say, I want to hire the people and I want them to be successful, but we have to do a lot more than we've done historically.
Thank you, and I should mention as we move forward, we have those wraparound services in place in Grand Rapids and in Detroit, as we have, and we can talk about that in another, if we have time, but that's critical as we think about how you keep people employed. Dr. Pink, talent and transportation.
Well, and I echo what Dave said. Again, you'll keep hearing me say this because I'm a deep believer. I don't think you can get, at least in education in our world, especially in this year, we can't get this done without partners. I don't believe we can do it and do it well without partnerships. And so when I say partnerships, I'm talking about K-12, I'm talking about, just from our standpoint, as a community college, our K-12 partners matter to us. Our four-year partners, our university partners matter to us because those are pathways as well. Our industry partners matter to us. And for them to be alongside of us is imperative. And when I say alongside, when we develop at our college, when we start talking about curriculum, when we start talking about decisions of what our program needs to look and sound like, our partners are there with us because that's who we're trying to prepare people for anyway. It's that the talent is going to them. Far be it from us to keep them out of that circle. But also our community-based partners, and I'm glad that you said that, Lejeune. Our community-based partners mean a lot because from a community college standpoint, our wraparound only goes so far around because of what we do. Our community-based partners complete that wraparound because those are some of the partners who can help in Grand Rapids. I think about Hope Network and others who can help with transportation and help get people to and from the job or even to and from their education experience with us. Or also when it comes to our community-based partners, when it comes to our campus, we know, and we see this across the country now, we have students, and when I say students at GRCC, I'm not talking just 18 and 19-year-olds. We're a community college. I'm talking 35, 40-year-olds as well and everything in between. I'm not just talking about 4.0s, I'm talking 0.4s and everything in between. And so what we know is that as our students come to campus, our data shows us that there are food insecurities as well as housing insecurities with many of these people coming to our campus. We have to connect them to those folks who can help get that wraparound so that that becomes less, if not nothing of a barrier. Because you and I both know, if I'm worried about where my next meal is going to come from or where I'm going to sleep tonight, how in the world am I going to learn English? It's just not going to happen. And so from our standpoint, we are focused on that wraparound to try to get rid of those barriers because the more we can get rid of barriers, and again, our partners are the ones who help us with that. Our partners are the ones who help us in getting in terms of not only getting rid of barriers, but then helping people see those pathways. So I believe in some of our efforts that I can also share a little bit later, I believe what we have seen is that those pipelines can be there if you have enough people at the table nod their heads saying, yeah, we'll help.
Great. Heidi, any best practices or any thoughts you have on where we are in Michigan on this issue of talent and transportation?
One thing I guess I'd like everyone to think about in terms of workforce is not just training the folks on the very bottom, where a lot of workforce dollars tend to be spent in terms of the people that are unemployed. And I think there's a lot to be said for continuing to upskill people and build that pipeline throughout their career. Somebody once said to me, if we continue to train only the people that are unemployed, there's only a handful of very low-skilled jobs. And it's like having a bucket full of sand and trying to put more sand in it. Like a couple grains will stick, but a whole bunch will also fall off. So just rotating people in and out of low-skilled jobs. But if we can take some people who are stable in their jobs, even if they started at a very low level, and continue to upskill them, we make more room at the bottom. And we continue to build people's abilities. So the workforce dollars cannot all focus on how to get people from the most desperate situations, because most of those people can manage a low-skill job if the opportunity presented itself. So if we can continue to pull that string up, make more room in that bucket, then we can fill it with more pieces of sand. And I think my advice is really thinking about how we're delivering to people at all different levels of the workforce.
I agree with that, and that's, I think everything that we're talking about when you talked about being relentless and also being, I think the other word I use is intentional. So looking for people in those point of entry jobs, but having a line of sight to what's their next job on the stair step and what's the third job and fourth job. So an example for us is, we want to bring people into our apprenticeship program to be overhead lines people. It's a well-paying, very honorable job with overtime. These folks, make $150,000 a year. Thinking about taking someone out of Detroit that we're working on that might, have academic deficits, maybe never worked before, and say you're going to become an apprentice seems like a large step. So what we're doing is the first job is a job we call groundskeeper, where they can actually, work doing property restoration. We work with Greening of Detroit and Goodwill Industries to place people into that job. The next stair step is to get into tree trimming. So DT Energy and Consumers, on any given day, we have 2,000 people in the state doing tree trimming, and that's a logical next step. The logical next step after that is an apprenticeship program, and thinking about the stair steps that you can build over time.
Yes.
But you got to start with the first job.
Yes, definitely. Any other comments on that? We will, as we are getting close to our close, I want to connect one more dot here because part of the report, and I think the most important message that we were wanting to send in the report is that when we get this right, we get this right for everyone. This isn't just an issue dealing with those who are most in need. It is an economic equation that results in benefits for everyone. Mm-hmm. So when we think about how everyone can participate in this process and begin to engage, the report gives lots of practical recommendations around how you can engage in this work. But one of the things that I think is really critical has been the partnerships that have been forming between business and the social sector and that safety net sector. And one thing I like to just talk about in this room is Dave as a business person and Dr. Pink in that social space, and then Heidi either way. What have we learned about how to make those partnerships work? Because we all now know that we need to have these types of partnerships. What we learned at the Kellogg Foundation is we needed to speak a different language, which was another genesis for this report, that we weren't speaking to business people in business language. And so what you'll see in the report is we had it piloted with business people so that it would resonate well. But as you think about the relationships and the partnerships that you're forming, what's some good tips you can give us on how do we engage and partner across these sectors?
I could just offer that I think for the business community, in many cases, it's just starting with admitting we don't know how to do things and that we need help, and there's really, really good partners out there that can help us. So I'll speak to another part of the unemployment spectrum, and that's people with disabilities, including people with autism. A lot of companies have said, we want to step into this space. And companies have said that, and then years later said, we still haven't hired anybody because we don't know how to interview, we don't know how to onboard, we don't know how to do this. So, working with partners like the Autism Alliance, Ford Motor Company, and others have started to step into this to understand how do we do peer training, supervisor training, how do we work with our HR systems to be able to help people with disabilities and really bump in, this is another subset of the population that you look at, that we have 90% unemployment. And if the businesses don't rewire how they think about this, and the one way to do that is to partner with people in the community.
One thing that I have found, and I think it's something we all realize is, and it's been proven to me time and time again, so one of the strongest ways that you impress someone to continue to come alongside you is by showing them that you used whatever it is that they gave you, whether it be advice, whether it be something that they gave you to help you cook tomorrow night's dinner. If they see that, they want to come back because you're using what they offer to you as suggestion. One of the best things that we do at GRCC, I believe, and in West Michigan, honestly, I believe, we collaborate like nobody's business. And part of that collaboration is because when I have our companies come to the table, when I have Birgit Close from The Right Place come to the table, or one of our four-year partners come to the table, and we all figure out and say, here's what we need to try, here's what we need to pilot, here's what we need to throw out there, and Birgit or someone says, I think you should do X, Y, and Z, and then on the end result, we see X, Y, and Z because it was a great idea. Now, our partner says, you know what, they listened to me. And if you listen to your partners, you're gonna gain a partner for long term. And so what we found is that when we have our partners at the table from the very beginning, that is a big key. Instead of assuming we know without them being in the room, we assume that we have no idea because we need them at the table to tell us, whether that be in building a training, whether it be in building a curriculum, whether it be in renovating one of our buildings. We want to have those partners at the table to say, here's what I think that ought to look like. And then as those partnerships grow, to be able to share out, and I think this is key to you when you talk about building partnerships, also at the end, be able to share out and really share out with your partners what the results were of that effort. right? So I can give you a couple examples of what we've done at GRCC with bringing partners to the table in trying to get people to work, people in some of our lower socioeconomic neighborhoods in Grand Rapids, getting them to work. When we partner with the Urban League, the Hispanic Center West Michigan, the Right Place, the Source, all of these entities, community-based organizations, when we partner with them and they're helping us in that regard, at the end of that training, at the end of that grant, at the end of that cycle, we want to make sure they understand here what the results were. This is what we did together. Because when you show data to partners, partners get excited and partners want to partner with you more. And so that's a huge thing.
Yes. Data is important.
I'll put one more quick thing out there.
I
know you,
and then, Heidi, why don't you, when you finish, I think this next question could be yours as well.
Oh, do you want to tie it together?
And it has to do with policies that we can consider, both public and private policies that can remove some of the barriers that we're encountering as we're doing this work. So let's first talk about the partnerships and then maybe think about some policies that maybe we should be thinking of.
I do think some of the more successful partnerships out there have been around sector strategies. I think there's quite a bit of evidence that is showing support for sector strategies. The Cleveland Fed, if you want to check out their website, did a detailed case analysis of 12 different sector strategies in and around Ohio. And one of them that stood out to me was a need for nurses in Western Pennsylvania. And the challenges of filling that skill in an area that's quite rural and does not have a lot of educational institutions to build up a lot of nurses. And the local healthcare practitioners collaborated, formed a partnership, and eventually pulled in the workforce trainers and colleges that they needed to build out this skill. At the end of the case study, what's interesting is they didn't get quite as many nurses as they had hoped for because it's a huge knowledge gap to fill, but they had gotten about 75% of the way. So the partnership was focused around a particular need. So not just we're getting together because we need skills, but they were very honed in on this particular skill, a particular type of nursing for what they were seeing as a blank spot in their community. And so I do think these sectors also have to be a little bit coming together and deciding, we have a lot of needs, but our top priority, our next priority, and then going after trying to create partnerships with some specific goals like that you can be able to achieve. In terms of policies for breaking down barriers, I think the biggest thing we need right now, I guess at the national and state level, is more flexible spending. I don't know what you face at community colleges, but there's been lots of talk about, for example, that Pell Grants are tied to semesters. And so folks that want to do training that's not semester-based through a college, that funding becomes very inflexible to be used for different types of training to meet needs that may not be lined up with a traditional college program. So one thing that we could push for from, like I said, both a national policy perspective as well as state and local, where the funding is coming from, is funding that is flexible enough to meet specific needs within a community, because I think that's a huge barrier.
LeJune, can I give you one at the state level that I'm just learning more about? I continue to learn about these barriers, and I think all of us should get really active on this one, and that is many of the professions, you need a state license to be able to do work, and about 70% of the state license have wording and the requirements for, they use the word good moral standing, which means if you have a felon, you can't get a license. So if you have been convicted of a felon, you can't cut hair in Michigan. And I think on some of these, we need to say this is ridiculous. We need to get rid of these rules. We actually have prison training programs that train people that are leaving the prison for jobs they're never going to be able to get because they can't get their license. Right. And they have appeal processes, they say, but I think the easier thing to do would be to look at these administratively. And I talked to the governor this morning, so we really need to go work on this. And if we need to pursue legislation, we should do that.
Exactly.
It's another example, one of those barriers we just have to peel off.
Great. Let me ask, there are a couple questions that are related, and it's interesting because on the one hand, they're asking how childcare fits into this equation, early child care, and on the other hand is elderly care. And how are we encountering that spectrum of the needs of our workers and both the needs of parents as well as children? Anyone want to take that?
Well, when you talk about just mentioning barriers, one thing that we know from our standpoint in working with some of our communities, transportation, we know things such as transportation. Childcare is one of those. When I'm not able to get to work because my child is sick, or I've got the daycare that across town is closed, whatever that be the case, we know from our data, it shows us childcare becomes an issue. But not just childcare, just even in terms of early childhood education, early childhood development, that we know if we're taking care of business as a state, if we're taking care of business when they're young, there are many things the data shows us that we alleviate and that we avoid as they get older. And so to really say that we value our children, to really say and prove that, I think is a huge question for all of us. But childcare and child development matters quite a bit in this regard.
Great. There's one last question. What's the role of economic developers in this space? Any examples of how we've engaged the economic developers? And it looks like we are just about out of time. 10 minutes? Okay.
I could give a quick answer.
Great, thank you.
I think there's a big role in economic development, not only increasing the number of jobs, but being very mindful about the jobs we want to bring into Michigan, but then also marrying economic development with workforce development. And the example that we use is when economic development landed Sakti Automotive into Detroit and they wanted to hire 200 people, then workforce development came in and was actually able to place 100 of the 200 are returning citizens. And it's an example when you're very, very thoughtful and mindful about this. On one hand, you got to create the jobs. The other hand is let's be mindful of trying to take people who otherwise would not be employed, have multiple barriers to employment, and get them into the jobs with the right wraparound services.
And in Grand Rapids, I again mentioned the right place and what Birgit Close and her staff, what they do, because their focus is not just from an economic development standpoint of bringing companies in, working with our education entities and other entities to help bring companies in, but what I appreciate about them as well is that they work on keeping companies. What do we do to help that company expand and grow? How can economic development help those member companies? And I think that is imperative to have that focus. If you want to call it a wraparound focus in economic development, it is just that. And that's of high importance.
Yes. Heidi, any comments on?
Yeah, when you think about jobs, you obviously think about both pieces, and yet they've been very separate worlds for a long time. My first job in DC was with IEDC, which is Economic Development Council, a professional organization for economic developers. And we did not teach any courses or have really any representatives at the time from the workforce development side of the house. That was 20 years ago, and today that's changed. But it was always separate. It was sort of education and business development operating quite separately. And places like IEDC, and I think which has influenced the local level, have tried to start to bring those entities together. I've seen some cities, I think Baltimore in particular, has joined those two in the city. Like those two offices are now combined and working together. But I think IEDC has pushed pretty hard to have other groups use that model where whether they're in the same office or not, that there's some type of collaboration between the folks that are representing those two sides of the house. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge based on history.
Okay, great, thank you. So one last question as we're getting close to the end. I wanna double down a little bit on the issue of education and creating the pipeline. And there are a couple questions here. One related to, what policies we can consider that allows people to not only have a solid educational pathway, but also credentials and access to credentials, et cetera, as they are in that space of adult learning and rehabilitating and skilling up. Can we speak a little bit about particularly the community college's role, but in general, I think this is a space where, you know, the vocational programs that really need to be in place more fully, it should be discussed as well. You want to start with the community college?
So I think about from our standpoint, and when I talk GRCC in this space, I also know that many of my colleagues across the state and other community colleges are doing the same thing. While on the credit side of GRCC, for credit, people going for associate degrees and moving on, in many cases, to either a job or their 4-year experience, we're a little over 14,000 students. On an annual basis, on our non-credit workforce training side of things, we are anywhere from 10 to 12, even sometimes 14,000 on that side as well. And so what that tells us is that that piece means a lot in terms of not only giving folks opportunities to get to work, but the two things that we focus on in those workforce training programs that go to this point, we want to train them for living wage jobs, right? We want to be able to give them training that's going to help them be able to take care of them and their family a little bit better. And we want to also make sure that those are, that we're focused not only on employment, but on upskilling as well, because upskilling matters quite a bit in that regard also.
Thank you.
Yeah. I was just going to add that I believe that the high school career and technical programs play a vital role, and for many years, I think students were guided towards you need to go to college, you need a 4-year degree or not. But at the same time, we're sitting there again, this is that disconnect with training and the employment place where today MEDC would say there's 10,000 unfilled skilled trades jobs, and that number's going to grow over the next 5 years because we got so many retirements coming through. And there are high school students that, rightly so, say, I want to work with my hands. I might go to college someday, but I want to be an electrician. I want to be a plumber. I want to be an automotive technician, which is another growing shortage in the state of Michigan. So putting up these programs and making middle school students aware, first of all, that there's career path choices, and these are viable career paths for you, and that doesn't rule out college. You can go get a skilled trades apprenticeship certification, come out of that apprenticeship program debt-free and have a good living. And if you want to go on to community college or a 4-year degree, that's fine too.
Absolutely.
I think vocational programs are really important. I think they've had 2 battles to overcome the last few years. One is a history of tracking and the perception that being tracked into vocational programs was lesser than being college bound. I think that's starting to change as people start weighing the cost of going to college and the types of careers they want, where perhaps they can get a good salary at the other end without the cost of a 4-year university. But I do think that perception has been hard, and also who will make the decision of who will go into vocational training because of the history of tracking. So the schools don't really want to make the decision, and parents and children, I think, are going to have to push for it on their own if that's what they want, so that there's not that weight on the administration. I also think schools have really battled with being asked to do a lot for kids. Everything from teaching health issues to finance issues to all the basics to get into college, and also leaving people job ready. And I think there's a lot of push-pull in high schools in terms of the number of things that these schools are asking to provide to children. That said, I think we have to work through it. I mean, I think we have to actually, I think we owe it to children that they're able to get a job when they leave high school if that's what they want to do, because that's the portion of their education that's completely paid for by living at home. And I think that they should be able to leave school and access a job if that's what they would like to do without having to take out loans or shell out additional cash. So to me personally, I think vocational training is very important in terms of building a pipeline of workers that will not be starting their life with a lot of debt. unless they come from a very wealthy household.
Okay, we're getting down to the end. I'm going to ask one last question. And I want to take it all the way back to the beginning of this conversation. We were talking about this relentless positive action, right? How do we move forward? And we have been doing some work, as we've heard. But what we want to do moving forward is accelerate the pace of what we're doing. And I think be very intentional about equity, because, you know, the work that we've done so far has led us to, I think, a state where, while there's 3.2% unemployment, that's for 4% unemployment, 3.2% unemployment for whites, 9.1% unemployment for blacks and people of color. And so as we move forward, we of course we want to address this workforce issue, but how can we do it in an equitable way and quickly? Any last thoughts on what we can do quickly to accelerate the work that we're already doing in an equitable way? Any thoughts?
I would just offer, from the business perspective, we need more leaders basically establishing really tough goals for their organization to say, this is not negotiable. This is how we're going to hire people, including an example of DT Energy. Between our foundation and what we bring in, we sponsor 1,500 kids in summer youth employment. This year, we said we're going to take 200 positions, and these are going to be for positions of students with multiple barriers to employment. And I know when that goal was first set, the folks in HR and the people that run that gulped and said, I don't know how we're going to do that, but we did it. And we'll do it again. And then we'll ask other business leaders to join us. So I think it really is, the people that are hiring are going to have to take that position and say, this is not optional. This is how we are going to go about hiring people.
Great.
I would say real quick, two things. Number one, the document you have at your table, that report there from the Kellogg Foundation, show them one piece of data. And this doesn't take long. You want to talk about quick, it's an email here in the next 5 minutes if you need to send it. Send it to those partners and show them the number $92 billion. $92 billion is what it means in that report to Michigan if we can get rid of these disparities. So data counts. If everyone believes in data, which I think we do, that's one number you show them, 92 million. And then the other thing you do after that is relentlessly keep calling them saying, we need to get together. We need to get together. Get people together in the room so that you can not only talk about it, but then determine what the action plan is after you talk about it, because there's too much talking going on. I'll stop there.
Heidi, last thought?
I can't beat that. That was the best. But I think we also, on a lighter note, need mentors out there and people that can provide examples to children that they may not have in front of them of what they really can do. And people only know what they know. So making sure that they know that there's a wider range of possibilities for them than they may have been otherwise exposed to.
Yeah.
So I'll close by just saying our founder would always say to us, Will Keith Kellogg would always say to us, we know much more than we do. And this is a case where we know a lot. There's a lot of knowledge in the report. It is time to do. It is time for us to come together and act and remove these barriers and provide equity and opportunities for everyone in our state, because it is, all of us have a stake in this game. And so I think we want you to hear more than anything else, it is time for all of us to act and act with intention. Thank you.